Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. If we could just wait for a few minutes, or less than 60 seconds as we wait for more people to join the webinar, and we'll get started. Thank you all for attending. Just give us about 60 seconds. Well, thank you all for your patience. I appreciate your time. My name is Andrew Savini. I'll be moderating the panel today. I'm a vice president at Elevate. We're very lucky today to have the Equitable Food Initiative join us as part of our webinar series as we try to think about how to support companies to be leading companies and best practices around responsible sourcing and best business practices around corporate responsibility. Today, we're talking about sustaining food supply continuity while keeping workers safe. This is part of a webinar series that Elevate gives every year to a wide variety of audiences and geographies. Please, you've already been muted, but should you have a question, the control box on the right side of the control pane should be able to allow for a Q&A live. Any questions that we can't answer during or towards the end of this presentation will be addressed in a subsequent follow-up emails to any of the attendees today. This leadership webinar is part of the leadership series for Elevate. And it's important to note early on, before we get into it, that the data that we're mostly going to be sharing is from the Americas context, but future conversations around other geographies are certainly, we're certainly welcome to it and open to having those conversations. We're very pleased to have a number of experts join us for today's call, one from Elevate and one from the Equitable Food Initiative. We have Megan Quinlan, who is our vice president of the customer team, who specifically is charged with being our expert on food and agriculture. Megan's been with Elevate for about 5 years. She has 15 years of experience in sustainable public-private partnership building and sustainable program building with a number of companies, brands, and retailers. She's also works in a number of standard setting advisory positions, including supporting EFI in their continuing evolution of supporting standardization and improving the lives of workers in food supply chains. In addition, we have Peter O'Driscoll, the Executive Director of EFI, who's joined us for today's hour-long webinar. Peter's been with, actually has been kind of a seminal and a leader in creating and improving and evolving the activities that the EFI has. Prior to the EFI, he was a director at Oxfam America, and he has quite a significant and robust background in food supply chains and workers in food supply chains in Latin America and in the Americas region. So we're very lucky to have him. Peter, I'd like to hand it over to you to explain a little bit more about EFI and what you all do.
Thanks, Andrew. Equitable Food Initiative is a skill building and certification organization for the fresh produce industries in the Americas. We base our program on a skill building approach around problem solving, communication, and collaboration among workers and managers. On every farm and processing facility that we certify, we create what we call a leadership team with representation from across the workforce and management. That helps us to build a continuous improvement problem-solving approach to challenges around implementation of our food safety, labor, and pest management standards. But that same labor management collaboration problem-solving approach can be applied to any kind of business challenge or business performance opportunity in the farm. In the context of the COVID-19 crisis, as you can imagine, we have been in contact with a number of the farms in our network, and we're delighted to bring to this webinar some of the best thinking that our participating suppliers have brought to this challenge.
Thank you, Peter. We also thought we would, before getting into the meat of the conversation, we wanted to talk a bit about the effort that Elevate's, as many of you know, if you're clients of Elevate, you've participated in some of our webinars, and each year we do have a theme. This year, our theme is around ESG, but we wanted to make sure that we talked a bit to some of the changing elements that I think a lot of us are facing with this rising pandemic. We see a number of companies having to shift priorities, and a number of responsible sourcing and corporate responsibility professionals and sustainability professionals are asking questions around what is material to my business, what is essential to the role that my department plays within our companies to engender change and to have effective programs. And Elevate believes that this year and this moment provides a number of opportunities to reevaluate and reassess and reinvent some of the ways that we approach responsible business practices within supply chains that can or cannot hopefully impact the workers in positive ways that are in our supply chains. And we think that this moment does provide a real opportunity to kind of rethink some of these things and reframe some of our work. So you'll see more of these types of conversations coming out this year. COVID-19, does present a number of challenges that we're trying to think through, not just with partners like EFI, but also our business partners and clients, such as many on the call today. So with that, and to speak more to the future of responsible sourcing and the impacts that workers and farms are experiencing, I'll now hand it over to Megan Quinlan to jump into the presentation.
Sure. Thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks so much to everyone for joining today. It feels so great to be discussing this topic with so many of you. So today we're really going to talk about the risks and scale of issues facing food and agricultural workers today, in particular in light of COVID-19. So as you all know on this webinar, since we live it and breathe it and increasingly are being inundated with it in the news, managing our food supply chains in 2020 and doing so in a sustainable way is an incredibly challenging task that requires understanding and adjustment to a rapidly changing environment. First and foremost, of course, at the moment is coronavirus or COVID-19 and the associated supply chain disruption that we're seeing as a result of it. In particular, it's the disruptions and concern with continuity of supply. Continuity of supply being affected by three key areas is really how we're thinking of it. Those being health and safety concerns, which lead to the closing or potential closing of processing plants and farms, uncertainty of the availability of the migrant labor force, exacerbating the labor shortage issue, as well as financial solvency as demand fluctuates. But supply chain disruptions didn't just start 6 weeks ago, right, when COVID-19 really went to a new level, and the challenges didn't even just start in 2019. But if we look back, currently with what we're dealing with, we also see major disruptions with the trade war. A lot of times we think of this being really focused on our manufacturing supply chain, but if we're thinking about the U.S., well, of course, Canada and Mexico are our largest trading partners. China is our next largest, actually, and it has had a large impact. Of course, some products are affected more than others. Our largest export is soy in the U.S., 60% of which is purchased by China, along with a significant portion of our pork. We've seen skyrocketing imports, actually, of fruit and vegetables, processed fruit and vegetables, into the U.S. over the last couple of decades, growth of which has been, hampered with the trade war. And the government recognized, obviously, that there was disruption to the food and agriculture sector in 2019, which is why there was a $16 billion bailout for farmers hurt by the trade war. We've also seen the interest in investors as consumer demands shift and evolve. They are demanding to see how food supply chains speak to labor and environmental practices. Last year, we saw, a full 2/3 of shareholder resolutions were focused on environmental and social issues. And so while there has been an increase in monitoring food supply chains, particularly in the Americas, there seems to be an increase in demand on predictive evidence and disclosure, as it's not possible or not likely or not ideal potentially to visit every farm the same way that we do in manufacturing. So as an industry, we're still trying to figure out how do we do this smarter, how do we do this better. And consumers are demanding more in terms of traceability as well. Everybody wants to know, where did my food come from? I'm putting it in my body. So the food industry, of course, is continuing to leverage technology such as blockchain to address some of those concerns as well. So there's a lot going on to keep us on our toes, if you will, to continue managing our supply chains, manage the the labor and environmental aspects of our supply chains. And before I get directly into the risks associated with COVID-19, I really wanted to take a moment to set the stage on overall trends that we're seeing within social and environmental compliance within the US and Mexico. So for those of you that are not familiar with EIQ, EIQ is Elevate's analytics portal. So there's basically two types of data. One is publicly available reputable data, such as UNICEF's Child Labor Index, such as the Walk Free Foundation Global Slavery Index, such as the UN Human Development Index, such as the US Department of State TIP report, also including, for example, fatal and non-fatal injury indices from the ILO. So all types of great data. And then in addition, for those of you that have been with Elevate for a long time, you know that for quite a long time, even before we were Elevate, back from when we were LevelWorks, we've taken incredible pride in our data. And every time that we visited any farm, any facility, any ranch, we've collected a couple hundred data points specifically related to social environmental compliance, such as presence of child labor, such as wages, working hours, some indicators related to forced labor. And so what that means is, of these 15,000 audits that we do a year, of these 2 million plus workers that we've engaged, we have this very micro level data that we've kept within a database that we've now overlaid with this publicly available data. So that's the data that you're looking at here. And what I really want to call attention to in this case is that the US, as you can see, has moved from a low risk country to a high risk country, or sorry, low risk country to a medium risk country. This is a deterioration of score by 20% over the last 5 years. And of course, a lot of us in our social compliance programs and our sustainability view, we continue to think of the US as low risk. We might not have so much monitoring there. We might not have so much reporting based on what's happening there, but there are real risks there. Some of the key risks, and the ones I've highlighted in red, are the ones I think have some. There's going to be some direct corollaries also with the risks that we're going to see increasing with COVID-19. So we're seeing some of the key risks around forced labor, migrant workers, and working hours. There's also key risks on occupational health and safety, in addition to kind of overall management systems and health and safety policies. Mexico, it's a similar story. Here it's a deterioration by about 15% in the score, medium to high risk in this case. Again, forced labor is challenges, injury records, occupational health and safety, and business licensing. So whether businesses are actually licensed and legally operating. So as we move into the supply chain resilience for brands and retailers during COVID-19, we really see that the continuity of supply is being questioned, right? So, and this is within three key buckets or three key areas. As I mentioned before, we have health and safety concerns leading to the closing or potential closing of processing plants. We already see that, of course, we know that COVID is highly contagious. And so once it kind of affects one worker, it affects all of your workers. We've already seen plants being closed because of COVID deaths and the plant subsequently needing to shutter its doors. We see the uncertainty of the availability of the migrant labor force, and as many of us know, this is a significant portion of our labor force. The National Agriculture Workers Survey estimates that about 70% of the workforce in the U.S. is immigrant labor. Also, according to NAWS, about 50% of farm workers lack legal documentation to work in the U.S. Although, of course, growers and workers' rights group estimates that's closer to 70% as well. So you have this highly vulnerable workforce without necessarily access to health care, for example, that have fear to come to work on the farms or within the processing facilities at this time. There's also rapidly changing legislation related to visas and travel related to essential migrant workers. You know, as governments and people, companies are trying to deal with how do we manage this best. Likewise, you know, kind of the third prong is the financial solvency of farms and processing plants. We have entire areas of the food sector, such as food service, whose demand plummeted to zero within a few weeks, while we have other areas that have been erratic, with surges in demand and then drops. So there's many risks that are really going to the next level. So if we kind of do the double click, if you will, with looking at health and safety, as I showed you, there was a decline of about 25% within the health and safety sector within the US. In particular, I want to call your attention to hygiene and sanitation in the US. That's decreased by about 30% over the last 5 years, as we've all been well inundated with the importance of washing our hands and you know, wearing masks. I think everybody knows the direct correlation with COVID there. Also, occupational safety index, which covers a number of things, but among those are things like proper protection for juvenile workers or pregnant workers, first aid, PPE, so a number of things. We've also seen a significant deterioration there, as well as, you know, similar trends within Mexico, which also decreased by 30% within health and safety in particular. So with that, you know, if we consider that in the face of COVID-19, you know, to protect workers during COVID-19, there's an actual increase in cost and a decrease in productivity for suppliers at a time when the market is very fluid. And I'd actually like to turn it over to Peter to talk a little bit more about, you know, what he's, some of the conversations he's having with people in the field and kind of on the ground, so to speak.
Thanks very much, Megan. As we look at the impact of worker health and safety on continuity of supply, I think it's really important to pause and think about the impact on the workforce. Every single person listening to this webinar has had our lives turned upside down by the coronavirus crisis. Many of us are able to work from home, but as everybody here knows, food supply workers are deemed essential, therefore don't have the option of working from home, and they are really on the front lines of this crisis. As we speak to employers and workers in those leadership teams that we have trained on our farms, I'd like to highlight 3 important issues that workers are experiencing at this point. The first, as Megan suggested, is that they're feeling the same sense of fear and uncertainty that everybody else in the global economy is experiencing. The difference is that because of language and cultural access, access to the internet and so forth, those farm workers and food service workers are not necessarily getting access to the kind of information that they need about how they can keep themselves safe, both in the workplace and in their homes and communities. So the level of fear and uncertainty, particularly in a population that is already vulnerable, perhaps on the basis of language skills, perhaps on the basis of documentation status, this cannot be underscored. And as we look to the short, medium, and long-term future of supply chain, the importance of addressing those fears and concerns of the workforce is really paramount. The second thing I want to point out is that just as many of the folks on this webinar are taking care of kids or elderly parents as a result of interruptions in school and other social institutions, workers are facing a real challenge around childcare. Whether it's daycare for younger children or the fact that their schools are closed, we're hearing that workers are having to leave their kids at home alone during the day in order to go and harvest product in the fields. This is a major concern, and it raises, kind of highlights the need for public policy solutions for essential workers, particularly farm workers, around provision of childcare support. The third area I want to highlight, which is painfully ironic for food service workers, is the question of access to food. Again, all of us on this webinar are experiencing shortages and changes in availability of food products in our supermarkets. But farm workers in particular are based in rural areas, and that's where some of these shortages are really most acute. Again, ironically, workers who produce food are having the hardest time accessing food. Part of that is because of their long working hours and having to go to the supermarkets at night, finding that the shelves are bare by then. Some of it has to do with broader problems of food deserts in rural communities. But the main concern here is that this workforce that's experiencing fear, that has additional stresses around childcare, is also increasingly reliant on food banks and community services for access to food. As we think about the long-term supply chain impacts as well, let's just recognize that workers who are not getting access to information about healthcare prevention, workers whose employers are not paying enough attention to social distancing in the workplace are much more likely to get sick. Workers living in tight quarters close to each other are much more likely to spread this virus. And the reality that we're seeing in some of the meat packing establishments across the United States these days, with the closures that are highlighted in the press, could just as easily apply to the harvesting activities in the fields. So the industry really needs to be ready for the possibility of widespread outbreaks in this community, which would absolutely threaten continuity of supply down the road. So the importance of prevention, education, access to information cannot be overstated. Megan.
Megan, I believe you're self-muted.
As a matter of fact, I was muted. So thank you so much for that, Peter. As we turn to look at the next risk, I'd really like to draw our attention to, related to continuity of supply, I'd like to turn our attention to looking at our reliance on migrant labor and the effect COVID-19 is having on that and exacerbating our already challenge around labor shortage. It also interrelates with our challenges related to forced labor. So if you're looking here, you can see that in the US in particular, and this is without COVID-19, this is looking at the last 5 years, you'll see that there was an 80% decline related to forced labor. So this is instances of forced labor within the US, as well as the high likelihood of migrant labor as well. These are directly interrelated. Migrant labor is saying that there's a high presence of migrant workers and that the number of origin countries. So here we see that there's very high vulnerable population in addition to a deterioration of working hours. Within Mexico, what we're seeing is that there's also a strong decline in forced labor as well as with humane treatment. So as we think of this within the context of COVID-19 and us needing to bring these workers up, use these workers to continue to harvest for our food and process in our processing plants, I was going to turn over to Peter to talk a little bit more about the specific risks there.
Thanks, Megan. And yeah, now that we've highlighted the risks of spread of the coronavirus within the farm labor workforce on the continuity of supply, it's really important to underscore some elements that I'm sure the listeners to this webinar are already aware of. The fresh produce industry in the United States and in Mexico for some time now had already been struggling with a labor shortage. So the impact of a potential widespread infection in this workforce would only magnify an underlying problem. That pre-existing labor shortage in the United States and Mexico has to do with a number of factors. Part of it is the aging of the workforce. This is a phenomenon that's been well documented. As farm workers age, often we find that their children are less willing or less interested in following them into the agricultural workforce. That's had a huge impact on the availability of labor. Obviously, over the last 10 or more years in the United States, immigration enforcement, the deportation of undocumented workers, the effect on others who are now less willing to move into this sector has had a huge impact as well. So it's important to understand that coronavirus is affecting a labor force that was already somewhat precarious. Given that problem, in the United States and in Canada and Mexico as well, there has been an increased focus on the need for guest workers. And so as recruiters provide H-2A visa workers in the States or through Canadian or other guest worker programs, they are opening up a whole new area of risk. The fact of the matter is that when US or Canadian employers engage guest workers from Mexico or Central America, there is a lot of background prior to the arrival of those workers in the US or Canada that the employer simply will not have access to. It is well established that many workers are recruited in their communities of origin and are forced to pay different kinds of fees in order to access guest worker programs. Again, the employer may have no knowledge of the debts or the payments that workers make simply to access these programs. If those workers go into debt to pay those recruitment fees, often at exorbitant interest rates, they can effectively become indentured servants who use their guest worker work to pay off the debts they incurred in their communities of origin. Again, this is an area that is not widely understood, that is extremely difficult to quantify. There's some interesting research going into attempt to quantify the cost that workers pay to access these programs, sometimes through illicit organizations, sometimes through the payment of fees for medical exams or documentation. But in some cases, we have reason to believe that it runs into the thousands of dollars. Obviously, any sort of ethical labor practices would not accept the payment of these recruitment fees. This principle of employer pays is widely accepted in the industry, but there's a lack of transparency and a huge need to focus more on this issue of recruitment fees. Forced labor, which is essentially what workers who are indentured servants are facing, is actually exacerbated during COVID-19. Given the labor shortage, given the impact of the surge in demand, particularly in the month of March when consumers engaged in panic buying, there is anecdotal evidence that workers are being forced to work longer hours, that they may or may not be accessing the kind of overtime wages to which they are entitled. And given the lack in many cases of adequate grievance mechanisms or mechanisms for worker voice on farms, their susceptibility to this kind of wage and hour abuse or to other forms of verbal sexual harassment, workplace abuse, exploitation is not well enough understood. From an EFI perspective, we want to highlight again and again that there are lots and lots of employers who are going above and beyond to address these concerns. But there's a sector of the workforce that continues to report these kinds of problems. And for the buying community, it's extremely important that they ask themselves what they need to know about the labor practices of their suppliers. Megan?
Great, thank you. So the third area of risk related to continuity of supply in the face of COVID-19 that also relates to the social compliance area is that of financial solvency. So a lot of times what we see when growers, suppliers, harvesters are having a hard time with financial solvency, we see that appear within wages and working hours. So both within the case of US and Mexico, you can see that we've seen a strong decrease in the performance of working hours, which actually means a high increase in the number of working hours. But what does that mean in terms of what we're looking at right now, and why are we concerned about that right now? What we do know is that there are huge margin pressures right now. Those are the increased costs and decreased productivity related to COVID-19, many of which Peter was discussing a few slides back on health and safety. When you're deploying new hand sanitization stations, when you're having security guards direct your workers where to be, when you're disrupting the productivity in your field by splitting up crews, you're bringing in additional transportation. This all comes with a cost in addition to the additional PPE costs. So there's even greater margin pressure. In addition, we see a huge decline in full service restaurant and school meal demand. So for those suppliers that were previously servicing cafeterias, whether it be work or school or restaurants, basically their demand went to zero rather rapidly. There's also been huge unanticipated decline in commodity prices, and this is still all working itself out. You know, in March, I saw that the price of palm oil dropped by 15%. Analysts are saying, you know, milk, they expect to drop by about 20%. So, you know, as you have supply chains that have these great changes in the prices that they're receiving, all of a sudden, it obviously directly affects their financial solvency. In addition, there's increased challenges around logistics and transportation as companies are trying to figure out how to make it work with closed borders and some of the restrictions of COVID-19, and an overall lack of planning capacity. So, you know, somewhat related to, for example, the decline in full service restaurants and school meal demand, we also see that, you know, there are huge surges in the supermarket followed by drop-offs. As we're heading into recession, you know, different products expect to be affected in different ways by that. So overall, it's a really trying position financially to be in to try to manage, in addition to all the health and safety and labor shortage concerns. This actually has not gone unnoticed by the U.S. government. So, for example, a suggestion put out earlier this week was to further reduce farm worker pay as a way to actually help the margins of the farms. So, you know, this is to say that this is a very strong need, and it's very real right now. And again, if you look at all of this in the context of your brand and your brand reputation, I think that there's, you know, there's tremendous pressure, and there's some sense that this might be an exception, that, you know, that managing our business, you know, finding that right balance with social compliance and protecting health and safety and farm workers, you know, there might be a little bit of an exception at this point in time. But we know that that's not actually really true. Investors do not, for example, in the manufacturing supply chain, consider the trade war as an exception for performance on the social or environmental side. That, you know, social environmental pressures continue to grow and trend upwards. We also know that already NGOs are calling food retailers, asking what they're doing to support their supply chains. There's already some shaming in the papers. And we also know that poor rankings lead to negative media attention, which leads to reduced interest from investors. And I know, of course, that the graphic on the right-hand side of the page can be a lightning rod for some. We know that obviously the rankings aren't necessarily reflective of the program. Some of it is often reflective of, you know, how much time is spent filling out the questionnaires, etc. But the only reason I have it here is to highlight that the areas of lowest performance across the board were workers, farmers, and women. So, you know, the good news is that we're seeing that there's some convergence on what good looks like on human rights rankings. And we've also been seeing that the most common quick fixes to improve rankings relating to public disclosure is setting up worker voice strategy or grievance line. So we can talk a little bit more on that in solutions. But I, again, just wanted to bring that back together to, you know, we have all this business pressure, and then that also leads us to consider our reputational risk as well. So that takes us to the next section, which is really determining our level of exposure. We've talked a lot about risks, what we're seeing out there, and I thought I'd turn it over to Peter to talk about, you know, not everything's bad, right? There's actually some great examples of things happening, as well as some areas where we know there needs to be, you know, some greater supply chain involvement. So Peter, do you want to talk for a moment about that, please?
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, all of you on this webinar are aware that over the past several weeks, there's been an increasing amount of press attention to food workers and farm workers on the front lines of the struggle against this coronavirus, right? In many ways, folks are beginning to elevate essential food workers to the same level as healthcare professionals or first responders and some of the other folks who are most exposed and most addressing the immediate impacts of this crisis. And that can be a good and a bad thing. It's not hard to find stories in the press of some of the real threats and risks that the industry is facing, right? We're hearing stories in certain parts of the country about the possibility of isolation camps for workers if these pandemic spreads widely through the workforce. And we're also hearing concerns from workers themselves about the lack of precautions that their employers are taking, the level of fear that is already beginning to impact the willingness of workers to work in certain establishments, and that's obviously going to have an impact on supply. However, to Megan's point, it's also really important to understand that among the heroic responses to this pandemic, there are plenty of suppliers in your network who are taking extraordinary measures and working overtime to minimize the impact of this epidemic or pandemic on their workers. We at EFI, and I'll speak a little bit more about this in a moment, have set up a clearinghouse in an effort to allow suppliers to exchange ideas and information and protocols and practices with each other. There is no silver bullet. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to this, given the variety of different farming and processing operations. However, there is an opportunity for suppliers in a pre-competitive sense to help each other brainstorm the best approaches to this solution. What that means for you in the buying community is essentially that you're buying product from a supplier network, and you have to ask yourself a basic question. Is each of the suppliers you work with implementing the kinds of worker protection programs and coronavirus mitigation strategies that are most likely to keep their workers safe and therefore most likely to keep that supplier in business over time, or not? Unfortunately, we do get the sense that there are some folks who are hoping this will go away, hoping it will not affect them. And if they're not implementing the kinds of practices that we're going to detail in a few moments, the chances are they will be affected, their workforce will be affected, and therefore your supply chain will be affected. So let me leave you pondering that question. How much do you know about the mitigation strategies that your suppliers are implementing? Megan.
Great, thanks, Peter. And so, the first steps in determining the level of exposure for your business, it really starts with traceability. And so these questions here, these actually aren't unique to COVID. It's understanding and mapping out your supply chain irregardless, right? So that when things such as COVID happen, when we have these disruptions, we know where our risk is and how to potentially deal with it. So how many growers do you work with? Who are the other buyers of your suppliers, especially those strategic suppliers that you have? Where are your harvesters located? What percentage of your workforce is migrant? What size are the ranches, are the harvesters, are the growers? Do you understand the regulations or topics by region and country? And this can even get into, is there access to healthcare? Is there, what kinds of subsidies exist? So all these different types of kind of macro availabilities that exist, not just from your supply chain, but because it's located in, let's say, Vietnam versus Mexico versus the US, what risk are you open to? So that's just, at the basic level. But then now additionally, within the face of COVID-19, what should you be understanding from your growers and your suppliers in particular? You should be aware of what COVID measures your growers, your suppliers, your harvesters are taking. You should be understanding how your supply chain is encouraging workers to take sick leave or to get tested or treated. And you should be understanding what investments the growers have made to protect their workers and address themes like social distancing. So there's a lot of emergent practices within this. And again, I'm going to turn over to Peter to talk about the specifics of those. But I think something to keep in mind as well is if your supplier, if your grower isn't able to give you robust responses, that's a red flag that maybe they haven't taken enough steps, right? So Peter, over to you to talk through the details a little bit more on that one.
Thanks, Megan. I do think it's helpful for the buying community to take a moment to step back and get a little bit granular on the challenges that suppliers, particularly in fresh produce, are facing with respect to this virus. So let me quickly walk you through some of the logistical challenges they're having to face. The first is, how do they get their workers to work in the first place? So this question of transportation, how do you practice social distancing on buses? Well, in many cases, what our employers are finding is that they need to hire 2 or 3 times as many buses to get their workers there. Think about the added cost as well as the organizational challenges of making sure that workers enter and exit that transportation safely and that they have adequate space around them on their way to and from work. A major headache for suppliers and a major additional cost that they're absorbing. Once the workers get to work, the same critical shortages of personal protective equipment that the entire nation is dealing with are also problems for produce suppliers. And this is particularly true, obviously, in the packing and processing plants, where workers have a much more difficult time practicing social distancing than they do in the open air and in the fields. Growers are necessarily having to establish more hand washing stations, provide more access to hand sanitizers and other things. Again, it's a logistical organizational challenge. It's also an additional investment. The way that suppliers, growers, processing workers are having to reorganize their work processes is a not insignificant challenge here. This has to do with everything from reorganizing the ways that crews harvest in order to establish social distancing in the fields, but it also has to do with creating and changing the size of the harvesting crews, reducing in some cases the crews to minimize the likelihood of contamination and spread of the disease, and keeping crews separate from each other so that if an outbreak does occur within a particular crew, it does not spread to another crew. Again, there are costs, there are work organization implications, and there are also significant logistical challenges. Those suppliers who are already using H2A or guest workers have an additional challenge in that the housing in which those workers are housed, even if it is high standard and very well accommodated, still typically is going to require them to live in close proximity, introducing sanitization and cleaning practices as well as social distancing in housing creates another set of challenges for the supplier community. The most basic rule to address information and prevention mitigation strategies for the workforce obviously involves communication. How do employers and workers communicate in an era of social distancing? They need to be more creative with respect to how they structure and organize meetings, whether they be tailgate sessions in the morning or the provision of information through videos in the lunchroom, through posters and so forth, which necessarily must be accessible to the workforce, both in terms of language and in terms of culture and education level. So the creation of tools and materials that actually give workers the information they need in accessible format is a real challenge that suppliers are taking on. There are a number of areas where before, during, and after the work day, workers are necessarily going to congregate, from break rooms to lunch rooms to parking lots. Every one of those now needs to be an area that is essentially policed or organized by some version of a traffic cop who can ensure that workers are maintaining safe distances between themselves and are not lapsing into behaviors that are higher risk for the transmission of the disease. We're talking about a number of details here, but partly it's to emphasize the challenge that your supplier base is facing, particularly those who are taking this threat very seriously and trying to respond, but also to emphasize that this is not simply a matter of changing the rules and announcing the rules. These kinds of behaviors, as all of us are discovering during the age of the coronavirus, require a culture shift, a fundamental shift in thinking. And the key point we at EFI want to emphasize is that these measures are much easier to implement and much more likely to stick in workplaces where workers and managers are accustomed to working together, where they have mechanisms for communication, for conflict resolution, for grievance procedures, and most importantly, for collaborative problem solving. And these are some of the skills that EFI is looking to introduce more broadly in the produce industry. Megan.
Great, thanks, Peter. And so now I'd like to turn us really over to, we've talked a lot about some of the risks and some of the challenges. So now it's a little bit about what can we do as an industry to protect our workers and support our growers and suppliers, while also, of course, protecting our brand. So if you look at this first slide here, looking at supporting agricultural suppliers, protecting workers and brands, as mentioned earlier, it starts out with buying teams to make sure that you're communicating to your growers, to your suppliers, what your expectations are. Increase this communication. You should be working with your growers, with your suppliers, to understand their investments, to understand your level of exposure, to understand the demographics of your supply chain specifically. We've also heard that while there's a lot of information that's been going, from the brand to the grower, or from the grower to management, it's not necessarily getting in the hands of workers. So there's been some questions about, how do you get at that last mile? How do you get the information on COVID-19 and make sure it's as up to date as possible to your workers? So there's different pulse education options using technology, LaborLink being one of those as an example. Likewise, there's been all kinds of support from some of our leading brands and retailers to help leverage their buying power to ensure that all facilities have the proper amounts of key equipment, such as temperature scanners, PPE, etc. And this would help across all of those three kind of main challenge areas of risk of continuity of supply, but also risk on the social compliance side. We've also seen that some clients and brands are using and leveraging their legal and HR staff to support suppliers, facilitating information to workers, suggested policies, legal support. Obviously, there's significant amount of change right now, and there's a lot of what feels like gray area as the situation is very fluid. So in those cases where you have sophisticated HR and legal departments to leverage some of that capability. Renegotiating contracts. This seems like a difficult one, but as we know, continuity of supply is critical for all of us to continue on. And so we know that the margins are low in the food industry and in at least many of the products. And we know that the costs are significantly higher and that the productivity needs to go down in this interim period during COVID-19. And so to ensure and maintain the continuity of supply, is there an opportunity to renegotiate contracts on an interim basis to help support with that additional cost and decrease in productivity to ensure that long-term continuity of supply is there and financial solvency is there? Is there a way to support direct additional costs? We've also seen this from some of our leading brands and retailers where they're directly supporting by additional personnel, cleaning, transportation vehicles, etc., even if it's leveraging some of the relationships with their vendors that they already have for their headquarters, etc., and utilizing those for some of their suppliers. We also see, though, that while there's all these steps being taken, there's still an interest from brands and retailers in particular to gain confidence that their supply chain is protected, that their workers are protected, so that they can have this continuity of supply, and so that they aren't open to these social compliance risks that are so important to investors and rankings, and making sure that they, at the minimum, that they are able to identify them so that they're able to address them. So there's a number of different ways that that different brands and retailers are opting to do that. I don't think I need to walk through each one of these, but you can do it through kind of a predictive analytic risk profile using EIQ, such as some of the data that I saw before to help segment and isolate, especially within your strategic suppliers. You can deploy worker surveys to get a real bottoms-up feel for what's happening on the ground, risks that are emerging. And again, that's going to be very low touch for farm management, which already has a lot of challenges on their plate. And there's self-assessment questionnaires to both get an idea of financial solvency as well as management systems that are in place. Some people are opting to do desktop assessments utilizing some type of SAQ and a document review. We in particular see certifications are going that route. EFI, for example, for its certified farms is requiring a desktop assessment and worker survey to make sure things are going as expected. The next one, grievance mechanisms, I think is particularly interesting. In this global time of global pandemic, vulnerable populations such as minimum wage workers are at great risk, as we've been talking about. In Bangladesh, Elevate runs the Amader Kota helpline, which provides workers with a mechanism to report and resolve safety and other concerns in the ready-made garment sector. So obviously this is garment and it's Bangladesh, so it's not food and ag and it's not the Americas. But what we've seen is that there's been a dramatic spike in concerned calls from factory workers in the last 3 weeks. We're getting over 5,000 calls a month at this point. It's a 4-fold increase. So for this, it's really about the number of calls that we used to get in a month, we're now getting in a week. And what these additional calls are about is a range of issues, but those include health and safety, coronavirus, wages, and factory closures. So again, directly related to some of the issues that we've been talking to here. And also, as I had mentioned earlier, when we were talking about the investors and ratings and rankings, we've also seen through our work with some of our key partners that kind of the most fast way, one of the most strategic ways to increase your rankings and ratings is by the use of a grievance line. So that's another idea for you. And then of course the virtual assessment. So, trying to make the assessment happen even though you would be doing that in a remote context. And the last thing, we've been talking a lot about farm workers today, processing plant workers, these vulnerable workers. And we're on the phone here with EFI. And one of the things I just kind of want to highlight to this team, or to the team on the phone, the partners on the phone, is, how worker engagement at Elevate, we do believe it can be a great tool in the toolbox for business-driven sustainability. We use it in a variety of ways. We actually integrate a worker sentiment survey with Elevate, every standard Elevate audit that we do. That's free of charge. It can be used to surface more reliable risk data, to improve compliance, to strengthen HR and management systems, as well as to measure impact and advance worker well-being. But one of the things that's, I think, interesting about the EFI model is also its focus on the bottoms-up approach, or incorporating the worker in the solution. So I wanted to turn it over to Peter to talk for just a moment about that.
Thanks, Megan. And one of the reasons that Equitable Food Initiative is so delighted to partner with Elevate in some of these initiatives is that I think we have a shared commitment in the importance of worker engagement, in the importance of creating space for worker voice and worker agency as a critical component in effective problem-solving strategies to improve supply chain assurance. In the context of COVID, where we found what we found particularly gratifying is that as we reach out to the network of certified EFI suppliers, as well as those who have begun the training process and are in the process of certification, is that universally they report back to us that amid this unprecedented challenge of adjusting their work processes, adjusting the workplaces to the threat of coronavirus in order to keep their workers safe, they have found time and again that the opportunity to work through these processes with a worker management collaborative team that is accustomed to the continuous improvement approach, that understands how to look at workplace design, workplace processes, threats to worker safety, issues around food safety. Because these worker manager teams already have expertise in taking on new challenges, they are perfectly well suited to the challenge of redesigning the workplace in the era of COVID-19. So you can see some of the practices that our worker manager teams have developed by going to Equitable Food /coronavirus. We would encourage you to share those materials with your suppliers. We've also developed materials in English and Spanish using popular education techniques to make sure that any worker can download a wallet-sized card with tips and advice on how to protect themselves at home, in the community, and in the workplace. This is vital information. The more this information is put in the hands of workers, the more workers have an opportunity to engage with their managers around solutions and coronavirus mitigation. The more effective that mitigation is going to be, and the more likely it is that this industry is going to be able to continue to provide the healthy food that we as a nation depend on.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. So really in wrapping up our key takeaways for today, I know it's been a lot of information. You know, I always feel after I've given a talk or after I've given a webinar, you know, have people really been listening to me talk for 45 minutes? In this case, though, thankfully it was broken up with Peter as well. But, you know, really our key takeaways are this. You know, we want you to remember that as risks are changing and priorities are shifting, responsible sourcing professionals are being called on to consider new ways of operating. Again, this is with and without COVID. COVID is just accelerating it even more. Risks in key sourcing markets for food and agriculture, such as Mexico and the US, have been steadily increasing over the last 5 years. And this is absolutely true if you look at Europe as well. It's absolutely true if you look at Australia. This is an area that is growing greatly in risk and also just in pressure from the industry, from consumers, from investors. In the wake of COVID-19, human rights challenges, protecting health and safety, life safety, protecting the vulnerable workforces, ensuring responsible recruitment, and protecting against labor shortages, combined with the financial solvency pressures, are exacerbating these issues and really threatening continuity of supply. And again, we've heard in the supply chains that we've been talking to in Europe, in Australia, we're seeing these same themes almost exactly in parallel. We're seeing that retailers and brands, suppliers, growers, harvesters, processors, you know, in many cases, everybody's working together to combat these risks, and we're seeing trends in the emerging practices, such as the place that Peter mentioned, where EFI has those listed. But nevertheless, the risk to continuity of supply and risk to workers, it actually still is on the rise, and we do still need to actively work together to mitigate this risk. Brands and retailers must understand their level of exposure first so that they can take action with their supply chain partners. And brands and retailers are increasingly identifying approaches to monitor, which may or may not be a traditional monitoring approach, so that their expectations are being held and that they can identify areas to support their growers and suppliers. So with that, Andrew, I'll turn it over to you and to the audience for Q&A.
Thanks, Megan. We have about 2 minutes for Q&A, so I thought I'd just jump into one of the questions that a few people had asked. Any of the questions that we aren't able to answer today, we will follow up in a specific email to you to answer that question. The question was about a little bit more specifics around this idea of remote visibility. I think a number of people have been asking about there's some trepidation to visit sites on site, but they want to be able to see the actual practices in person. How does these remote options kind of come into play for EFI or for Elevate?
Sure, I can take a stab at that first if that works for you, Peter. You know, it's definitely a concern of a lot of clients. It's the focus of probably most of the conversations that I'm having every day, to be honest with you, is, you know, we know that everybody's under tremendous pressure right now, but also now more than ever, we need to make sure that we're doing our job and making sure that our you know, our social compliance expectations are being upheld. And so there's a few ways to do that. And if you want to go back even to the previous slide, you know, we have the kind of lightest touch, which is the EIQ risk profile, which is pulling data in a more predictive way based on the demographics of your supply chain. We also can and do overlay this with web crawler information. So basically media combing, social media on anything related to your supply chain partners. You know, another way that has really gotten, I'd say, a lot of inertia in recent weeks is the worker surveys. You know, worker interviews are have a little bit more challenges when you're trying to do those over a webinar setting. They're already very sensitive issues. Trying to get the rapport built with workers is very difficult, but getting worker surveys that, you know, reach a broad audience and are able to connect on issues such as sick time, wages, kind of pressures that they're receiving have, you know, we've been seen as a really escalating tool to help resolve this. And that's often being paired, or in discussions of being paired with some type of document review of the management system. So, you know, while in a SAQ, you're not going to say something like, is there child labor? You might look at the management systems related to child labor, and then anything that might come up in a worker survey related to that. Grievance mechanisms, which I talked about earlier, and those, we've seen overall, this isn't related to COVID specifically, but in high risk countries or high risk country product pairings is where we're seeing kind of a lot of industries kind of come together to say, maybe we should do something together in this area. So for example, Elevate runs a grievance helpline in Malaysia for some participants in the palm sector. And then the virtual assessment, which is yep, exactly. So there's a little bit of a long answer. Sorry about that, but happy to follow up whoever asked.
No problem. Peter, do you have any 30 seconds to add to any of that about just that idea?
Sure, super quick. I'm going to say, to state the obvious, there are no perfect solutions, and I think all of us in this era of COVID are adapting to less perfect options. I would echo, in fact, EFI is working with Elevate on a number of the strategies that Megan mentioned, in particular, the opportunity to do remote desk surveying of documentation, and particularly using video technology for walkarounds. In other words, in order to have an employee on the farm actually walk around and point their video camera at particular areas that the auditor would like to inspect. However, that's not perfect, and as Megan mentioned, worker interviews over Zoom are really not acceptable in many ways. There are too many risks to the workers. The auditor's not going to know what's happening off camera and whether the worker is being coerced. However, on farms where there are functioning worker manager teams, whether they're EFI or some other format, those are opportunities for interviews where workers will be present, where workers are accustomed to working with managers. They will give you a higher level of information than you can get through other remote access options at this point.
Thank you, Peter. That was really insightful. Thank you, Megan. And thank you, everyone, today. These terminologies around continuity, resilience, communication, being in this together and using your leverage appropriately certainly speaks to the kinds of themes that we want to extrapolate and bring to the foreground in these conversations and in these webinars. So Peter, thank you for joining us, and Megan, thank you for your expertise. Just a couple things before we close out. We do have a webinar coming up for Elevate's webinar series to address themes in more manufacturing-oriented context coming up on the 28th and 30th with regard to wellness at work and supporting workers during COVID-19. We do have that in the Chinese language that's available on our website as well. In addition, like the EFI has on their website, we too have a COVID-19 resource center that speaks to a variety of sectors, not just food and agriculture, which EFI certainly has a pronounced amount of information for, but also with regard to the traditional manufacturing centers. We also ask that people continue to tap into our blog. We may have a blog post that speaks to some of the items that we spoke about today. And also, please feel free to check out all of the webinar recordings, including this one. It'll be listed on our website, www.elevatelimited.com. Finally, webinars are not the only part of our leadership series events. We do have our upcoming events that we may not be able to do in person now, but we have pushed them to the fourth quarter and early 2021 so that we can all gather together sometime after this crisis in some fashion to really network and do some group therapy, if you will, on some of the challenges that we're all facing and how we can overcome them together. So please keep abreast of the upcoming leadership series with Elevate. If you have any more questions, please feel free to email Peter and visit the Equitable Food website for more information on engaging workers and providing more visibility in the food supply chain. And if you have any questions for Elevate, feel free to reach out to myself or to Megan Quinlan, our resident expert in food and agriculture. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. Have a pleasant day, and best of luck with all of the chaos going on with COVID-19. Take care.